welcome to the Gulf Intelligence Global UAE Energy Forum 2021, where for one day at least, we're going to take a time out from our world and take an outlook for the year ahead on all things related to energy. And there is few things as important as China when it comes to just about everything. Energy is no exception. I'm Sean Evers, the managing partner of Gulf Intelligence, and it gives me great pleasure to be your host this morning. And even more pleasure to introduce our guest lecturer today, Mr. Ben Simpfendorfer, who is the CEO of Silk Road Associates. Ben is probably one of the longest China watchers, as they're called in the trade, a former chief economist for the Royal Bank of Scotland, for JP Morgan, and now CEO of his own consultancy for the last decade. Few people track the Belt Road Initiative as close as Ben. And one thing I would note as we start this lecture is how China's outreach to the world has evolved during the COVID pandemic. One from what had been a very hard infrastructure play, build your airport, build your road, to one now that's becoming increasingly soft and to the extent of the provision of the vaccines that are fighting this great pandemic. And I raised my hand of saying, I have a bit of China in me now as a taker of the Chinese vaccine. So on that note, Ben, I hand the floor to you for your 10-minute lecture, and we look forward to following up with questions. And anybody that has a question, please just post it in the chat room. Ben, unmute and please take the floor.
Thank you, Sean. Delighted to be joining Gulf Intelligence, Global UAE Energy Forum 2021. Really excited to be the kickoff, one of the kickoff events for a trip around the globe. It's all very exciting. Let me spend a few brief moments talking about China and where we think it will go over the coming 12 months, but more importantly, over the long term and the implications for the Silk Road. So China's economy has recovered faster than expected. It's been supported by an effective pandemic control strategy, timely policies, support, and surprisingly resilient exports. But the shape of recovery is uneven. Domestic demand has recovered more slowly than exports, consumption, more slowly than investment. We have, in effect, an economy experiencing multiple mini cycles. Now, real GDP growth is expected to slow to 2% in 2020 before accelerating this year up to nearly 8%, which sounds impressive given events, as consumer spending and business investment continue to catch up. But that projection assumes pandemic containment efforts, supported by the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines, of which Sean is clearly already a taker, will continue to keep new infection rates low and prevent the resurgence of large-scale outbreaks. Now, that's not guaranteed because Chinese New Year, which begins early next month, is a risk to that outlook as people begin to travel around the country again to celebrate the festival. And so the government is wary and taking action. Most critically, though, COVID-19 shock has accentuated what are pre-existing imbalances and structural challenges in the economy. The role of the government is greater than pre-pandemic. And while that's true around the world, it's a particular concern in China, given the importance of government spending on infrastructure and given the outside role of state-owned enterprises. So China must rebalance back towards consumer spending and the private sector to ensure a more healthy economy. We should see this process begin in 2021, but it will be a multi-year process. And that's important to recognize because it's China's long-term policies, which are arguably more important than the short-term growth outlook over the next 12 months. Why do I say that? Well, at last year's fifth plenum, a key political meeting, President Xi Jinping said China will become, and I use his words, a mid-tier developed country by 2035. That's less than 15 years away. Now, the party has always announced 5-year plans, but this is the first time the country has set out a long-range plan of 15 years. And it's this plan which will, over time, have the greatest impact both at home in China and abroad, across Asia, Middle East, and Africa, the Silk Road. So what does that mean? Well, 3 trends to look out for. The first is the shift towards new infrastructure. So rather than roads and bridges, the government is ramping up plans to construct new digital infrastructure across the country. What does that include? Well, 5G networks, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things. So these are plans that work in concert with China's other industrial policies like Made in China 2025 and the China Standards 2035 plan, which together signal China's ambitious long-term strategy of becoming the global leader in high-tech and innovative industries. The second long-term strategy we need to pay attention to is dual circulation, which is China's strategic approach to adapting to an increasingly unstable and hostile outside world. That means relying more on domestic demand rather than exports, given the risks of growing global trade protectionism, especially between China and the US. China will also push for technological self-reliance and has already provided incentives to build up domestic development and production of semiconductors and other cutting-edge technologies, particularly in areas that have been targeted by the United States. The third area we need to pay attention to over the long term, and perhaps most relevant to us on this call, is the expansion of Chinese digital companies abroad, especially into the Silk Road markets. These companies range from hardware suppliers such as Huawei, to smart devices such as Oppo, or e-commerce firms such as Alibaba, or other digital technologies such as Tencent. And while China's Belt and Road strategy has attracted much attention over the past 10 years, I find the digital Silk Road strategy almost more exciting, more sustainable, and more profitable. It was already advancing rapidly pre-pandemic, but COVID-19 has accelerated the change. Now, it's these long-term policies which will reshape China and its role in the global economy. China is on track to be the world's largest economy over the next 10 years. The country will remain a global manufacturing hub in leading industrial sectors. That's in spite of disruption in the global supply chain. What does this all mean for the Silk Road? Well, China is already the largest trading partner for many Silk Road countries. And that relationship will strengthen, especially in Southeast Asia, as parts of China's manufacturing base relocate to countries including Vietnam or Thailand. Vietnam especially has captured market share from China in products such as clothing, footwear, household electronics, and smartphones. Other countries such as Indonesia and India will also capture a growing share of production over the coming 10 years, albeit at a slower pace as they need to build out infrastructure and improve the business climate. That doesn't mean that China will lose its place as the world's manufacturing hub. It means that we're simply seeing a movement at the margin and growing connectivity in the supply chain between China and ASEAN and South Asia, because many of the component parts that are used in export production in countries such as Vietnam will come from where? Well, they come from China. So trade has been the biggest driver of the Silk Road over the past 20 years. And in fact, over the past 2,000 years, but we're now witness to a historic new stage in the Silk Road's development. That's digital technology, or a digital Silk Road, for which China will play a key role. And China's long-term development strategies mean the country will play an important role in developing 5G and IoT opportunities across the Silk Road, of course, but there are a range of other opportunities, whether that's in internet or fintech, agri-tech or medtech. Alibaba is perhaps best well known across the region as a leader in the fintech space and has already made investments into Thailand, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. Newsoft Medical is a leader in the medtech space, certainly in China, but has offices in Dubai, Kenya, Thailand, as it develops medtech opportunities. Even during the current pandemic, Newsoft Medical was working with Kenyan authorities to put all their COVID-19 data into the cloud and allowing them to then reach out to global experts. Didi Chuxing is another leader, but in the internet space, and they're already invested into multiple ride-hailing startups, including Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. So the next stage of the Silk Road's development promises to be really very exciting. Trade, of course, will be important, but ultimately we need to focus on digital trade. Certainly, that's where China's long-term ambitions lie. And that's where China's firms have often been most successful as they look to expand out across the Silk Road. And so that's just a taste of what the world will look like. And perhaps we begin to connect digitally, much as we do today, as opposed to traveling the thousands of kilometers that our ancestors once did. But it's an exciting new phase in the Silk Road's development, certainly one I'm very much looking forward to. Thank you, Sean. Back over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Inevitably, one can not. It's quite difficult to be anything but optimistic about the sort of continuation of China's rise. But in uh, last year, 2020, for the obvious reason, China suffered, one might say, the indignity of the same kind of growth that the rest of the world typically lives with all the time, 2-3%. I'm wondering, what is the legacy impact on that for China? And will we indeed see what is being forecast as an 8% growth in 2021? And how can that be achieved when the rest of the world is still quite ill, literally?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there are two reasons for it. That the first is more short-term technical explanation, and that is China entered an economic contraction before the rest of the world and came out of that contraction relatively quickly as it contained the pandemic. So by the second half of the year, certainly production was already looking quite robust. Investments were being made again. Exports, surprisingly, were quite strong throughout the pandemic, especially exports from just across the border from myself in Hong Kong, because those exports were digital products. They were the iPhones, the monitors, the webcams that we're all using today. Most of those were made in China. So it does mean that as we begin to move forward into the rest of this year, growth rates are very well positioned to grow quite strongly. Now there is some concern around those growth rates insofar that investment still plays a major role. And as I mentioned, the government doesn't want to continue to really drive growth forward. It perhaps would be more tolerant of a slightly lower growth rate of around 6% if that was driven by the consumer sector and in particular the private sector. So I perhaps focus less on the target growth rates, whether it's a 6, it's an 8, or it's a 10, and perhaps focus on the quality of growth. And here's where I think it's very exciting. It's those long-term growth plans. It's the ability at this point in time for the government to have the space to sit down rather than dealing with pandemic containment efforts to actually say, where do we want to be 15 years from now? And that, I think, is most exciting.
I mean, if you take that shift away from the kind of blunt end of the knife growth, i.e., manufacturing for a cheap margin of 1 penny on every doll you sell, to the higher end technology, Huawei and others, that inevitably would indicate less consumption of energy. Is China moving on to a trajectory where the per GDP percentage, the production of GDP takes less energy, and so the world needs to pay attention to that?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. So we are, short and sweet, we are moving to a world where energy consumption, say per capita or per dollar of output of GDP, will be less. There's no doubt about that, particularly as consumption moves away from just pure products and into services, which may be less energy intense. At the same time, factories, in order to cut costs, particularly when faced with global tariffs out of the US, energy savings are a key area, a focus of many firms. I know there's a lot of ambitions and plans and even activity at the moment to put solar panels across a range of factory roofs, again, to try and reduce energy intensity. Now, the only caveat to that, of course, is that the economy is expected to get bigger. And so as it gets bigger,
right,
then, of course, there will be more actors there who will be consuming energy. So there's a slight trade-off there.
I mean, one of the things I've always appreciated in our conversations over the years, Ben, has been the fact that you have gone out and kicked the tires, so to speak, on what is tangible and what is not. And this idea that the Chinese economy still has a large proportion of it that is sort of is dark. You can't see it, you can't touch it. The data remains somewhat suspicious. I'm wondering, where would you put that into the equation of analysis of China and its outlook? The idea that there is supposedly large numbers of companies that have sort of debt obligations that are off the books and all sorts of things. Where's the dark economy of China that we can't see? How big is it?
So I think the best way to answer that is to think of China as Europe, right? So there are parts of Europe which have very robust industrial sectors, say the Germany, for instance, where exports are still quite strong, and you can see a very sort of constructive long-term outlook. But then clearly there are other parts of Europe that are heavily indebted. And it's hard to see a way out for certainly for these countries. Growth rates will be low, populations are aging rapidly. China is much the same. And absolutely, there are parts of the country where industries are heavily indebted, and it's hard to see where their growth opportunities are. But then you have other cities such as Shenzhen, neighboring Hong Kong, which is a thriving technological hub, and very easy to think of growth rates at 10% for the next 10 years. GDP per capita of 40,000, 60,000 US dollars over the long term. And so these parts of the economy become very exciting. So as we start to talk more about China's long-term outlook, we need to say, which China are we talking about? Are we talking about the new economy, faster growing China, or the old economy, slower growing China? And those divergences will become clearer and clearer over time.
I mean, one of the things that one might note, take away from 2020, and there's many things obviously, but one is the way in which China took on a more robust external affairs posture. And it seemed like every week it was in some kind of diplomatic, nearly slash military face-off, whether on all sides, South China Sea, Taiwan, Australia, and beyond. I'm wondering, how should we interpret that as we look at China, and should we expect more of it? And what impact does it have then on the outlook for growth in Asia?
So we can't forget that China was effectively cut off from the international diplomatic system for decades, and only really returned in around the early 80s. And perhaps only since the early 2000s has been pursuing a more active diplomacy, especially across the Silk Road countries. And so it's a relatively new effort. And so in part, we could look at this as a learning curve. It may be that over time, some of the more robust statements are toned down as China begins to assess the response. And particularly public sentiment. I think, though, in part, a good way to answer that question is how important these countries see China's economy. So what you do see across many countries around the region, when populations are surveyed about their feelings towards China, that certainly those who view China's economy favorably, the share has been rising, even as the share who view China's influence on the world favorably perhaps has been falling. Now, that's not consistent across all countries, but what it does say is that so long as China's economy is important to the rest of the region, it is a way for us to make money, to earn a living, then perhaps this policy will be continued. But again, it very much depends on those growth rates, the ability of China to be able to deliver economic and commercial benefits for the rest of the world.
Ben, just to wrap up, as one of the few people I know that speaks fluent Mandarin and fluent Arabic, I know the Middle East is a very familiar and important part of your work, one end of the Silk Road, if you like. How do you see the outlook of the relationship with the Middle East? I mean, one of the things that we're all paying attention to is, what is America's role in the region? Are they withdrawing? Is China arriving? Now, clearly China is arriving. They're now producing upstream oil and gas production in the region. But the big question is, what is the future of that relationship? And is there a point in time when China actually takes up the sort of historical role that the US and the West has played here in providing a security blanket for the flow of oil and energy out of the region?
So China is unlikely to take up America's sort of traditional role. What it will do, though, is to focus on its commercial transactions across the region. And where it does provide some type of security blanket, most likely it's going to be in respect to its own imports of products, where it sees that the instability in the region has a direct impact on its domestic growth, right? But that also cuts both ways. It's not just about securing energy supplies, it's about reducing energy intensity at home, because there is a recognition that reliance on those imports is the direct threat. And to the end that, you know, China could be self-sufficient in energy, then it would no longer have a commercial interest in the region and no longer need to provide that security blanket. But certainly I think you could expect China to take a more robust approach to protecting its supply chains across the region.
Yeah. Well, Ben, listen, thank you so much. A great way to start the day in Hong Kong. We're going to end it in California in about 12 hours' time.